Philip, you live in New York. You're a Knicks fan. What's the most offensive thing that you've ever seen at Madison Square Garden?
The most offensive thing I've ever seen. Here's the most offensive thing. In 2005, when I was living in California, I actually came to New York and saw a Knicks game, and it was Reggie Miller's last game at the Garden.
Oh, no.
And there was a little kid there holding up a sign that said something like, thanks for the memories, Reggie, or something like that. And I think that was the most offensive thing because I am a strong believer in taking a hardline approach to one's sports enemies, right?
Reggie Miller is the man who has broken New York Knicks hearts
No, that's not. He is an old person who at one point in time
he wasn't
played
an old
for
person then.
Well, he is now, and he played for the Indiana Pacers. So the Indiana Pacers were sort of the rivals of the New York Knicks at a period when the real rival of the Knicks was the Bulls and Michael Jordan, but the Pacers kept being a pain sort of on the side.
It's basically like somebody shows up at a Biden event in 2021, early 2021, and they're like, thanks for the memories, Donald Trump, and it would be like a sincere thing. That's kind of what I...
Yeah, that's maybe a little further even than I would have taken it.
Welcome to the Campaign Moment from the Washington Post. I'm Aaron Blake, senior political reporter and author of the Campaign Moment newsletter. It's Tuesday, October 29th, and I'm joined today by one of my favorite people here at the Washington Post, Philip Bump, who is a national columnist focused on politics. Thanks for being here, Phil. Oh, man, I just called you Phil. Oh, my gosh.
I know, way to start strong, Air. Way to start strong, Air.
Okay.
Yeah, hi. Happy to be here. Or I was for a while.
So, Philip.
Yes, sir.
The election is 1 week away, and both the Harris and Trump campaigns are in their very last push. We're recording this on Tuesday morning, so some of the things that you might hear about will have changed after we record this. Vice President Kamala Harris is going to be holding a big rally on the Ellipse in Washington, D.C., near the White House, which is, of course, the same location that Trump held his January 6th rally before the insurrection at the Capitol. Donald Trump is holding a press conference in Florida this morning, followed by campaign stops in Pennsylvania this afternoon and this evening. But Philip, I wanted to talk to you today about another event that took place in New York over the weekend, and that's Donald Trump's rally at Madison Square Garden in New York City, because It's gotten a lot of attention for reasons the Trump campaign doesn't seem to like. And that is a series of crude, racist, and even sexist insults by some of the people that spoke on stage. So you and I have been writing a lot about this over the last few days. You wrote about the way the message at the Trump rally echoed a famous pro-Nazi rally that occurred at the same location in the 1930s, 1939 in particular. And both of us have been writing about the potential political impacts of this, specifically a remark at the Trump rally about Puerto Ricans, which we're going to talk about a little bit here. So a heads up before we start that, we will be playing not only that tape, but we will also be revisiting some of the offensive comments and crude language that Trump himself has offered in the past. Philip, you were in the vicinity of the rally. You were actually not inside, but you attempted to get inside. Can you tell me what it was like to be near Madison Square Garden while all of this was taking place?
Yeah, it was interesting. I just one very minor correction. The rally in 1939 that you referred to that was, explicitly pro Third Reich, Nazi Germany, was at the old Garden, which is up on 50th Street. So not the exact same location. Not that it really matters, except that the new Madison Square Garden is this epicenter of a very commercial aspect of New York City, right? It's where the Knicks play. It's where the New York Rangers play. It's where concerts are held. Fish comes and is there for 45 months or whatever it happens to be. Billy Joel's had 2,000 concerts there, right? Like, it is this place that literally sits on top of Penn Station. You can have people come in from Jersey and Long Island, as lots of people did for the rally on Sunday, and participate in a thing in New York City and then go back out. So it is a different sort of thing than it used to be. And the vibe around the Garden on Sunday was oddly like that of a sporting event, right? Because you had all of these supporters. If you go around the Garden at the time of a sporting event, like let's say a Rangers game, you'll see a bunch of people wearing Rangers gear, and then you'll see, whoever they're playing. Let's say they're playing the Penguins, to name one of the other three hockey teams I can name. You'll see, a few people in Penguins gear, and there'll be sort of a good-natured joshing back and forth between the fans. And it was that same vibe, except replaced Penguins with MAGA hats. It did not feel tense in the way that I was expecting / not enthusiastic about.
Interesting. So we're going to talk a lot on this show about not what the environment was around the rally, but what was said inside of it. And We're going to focus in particular on one speaker, a comedian whose comments have gotten the most attention. The comedian's name is Tony Hinchcliffe, who is someone who is very popular for roasting. It's his style of comedy. He's involved in the Comedy Central roasts and things like that. He was one of the opening speakers at the rally, and he made a lot of disparaging comments, including about Puerto Rico. Let's play some of the tape here.
There's a lot going on. I don't know if you guys know this, but there's literally a floating island of garbage in the middle of the ocean right now. Yeah. I think it's called Puerto Rico. Okay. All right. Okay.
As you can hear from that recording, it didn't even go over very well inside the crowd there of the Trump supporters who were present. And it's led to a significant backlash outside of the Madison Square Garden rally as well. Philip, when I saw this, I was instantly like, oh, this is going to be a problem for the Trump campaign. We're going to talk some more about how much of a problem, but what was your initial reaction when you first saw this?
To answer your question, my initial reaction was, yeah, that's what I'd expect. Right. Yeah, I can see
from
that.
This rally.
Yeah, exactly. And from a comedian who is going to speak at a Trump rally, like that joke, yeah, okay, yes. And I think even the response that you heard there was less, oh, than it was, ooh, gotcha, right? It's a different sort of gasping, surprise, right? In the I am sympathetic to it versus I, hold that in contempt. And I think it was the former.
Interesting.
And I think that one of the challenges the campaign has, obviously, is that it targeted a specific group of voters that the Trump campaign would probably rather not at this point in time antagonize. I think part of the problem, too, is it came he was the first guy to speak after the national anthem, right? And so it set the tone for the rest of what happened over the course of the day. It was here is the rally where they started with this racism against black people.
Cool black guy with a thing on his head. What the hell is that? A lampshade? Look at this guy. I'm just kidding. That's one of my buddies. He had a Halloween party last night. We had fun. We carved watermelons together. It was awesome.
Where he made, an anti-Semitic joke about Jewish people and money.
But you also know the Jews have a hard time throwing that paper. You know what I'm saying?
He made a joke about Taylor Swift getting killed by Travis Kelce.
I don't know about you guys, but I think that Travis Kelce might be the next O.J. Simpson.
There were a lot of other jokes that the dude made that sort of got buried under this one particular joke. And, I think it was a mistake on the part of the campaign. I think that goes without saying. But I also think it's important to recognize that there's almost an aspect of this that's beneficial to the campaign, because if he hadn't said that, we'd be talking instead about all the stuff that Trump said, which was toxic and hostile in a very familiar way to Donald Trump. But it's not as though the takeaway from the rally would have been wow, this was really actually a very positive and upbeat rally, except for Tony Hinchcliffe, and a few other speakers. And I don't think this is good for him at all politically. I don't want to say that. But I do think it allows the campaign to say oh, we're sorry that thing was said, at the same time that they don't then have to say, and by the way, what Donald Trump said, we need to contextualize and reframe because it was also damaging in its own way.
Yeah. As you mentioned, the Trump campaign has distanced itself somewhat from what Hinchcliffe said. They did not apologize, but they said that the comments didn't reflect the campaign. That seemed to be the talking point from a number of Republican members of Congress and others who weighed in on this. Republicans, especially in Florida, in New York, even Pennsylvania, and of course, Republicans from Puerto Rico, which is actually a pretty evenly divided territory. They have a proud history of Republican politicians succeeding in Puerto Rico. So you mentioned the idea that this could kind of cover up something else that's happening that maybe benefits the Trump campaign in a way. And I think that gets at something that's really important here, which is how much does this matter? Which is a question we often ask about these kinds of events. I'm of two minds on this. Like, this stuff almost never seems to have a real measurable impact with Trump. Like, he says stuff that's not that far off of what this speaker said about, Haiti. And,
he called America a garbage can like last week.
He called America
right?
garbage can last week. He's talked about another Caribbean island, Haiti, as a, quote, shithole. He's made racist comments about immigrants and others before. This wasn't even him speaking. This was somebody who was at his rally, although it appears the campaign was familiar with what this man was going to say. On the other hand, the Trump campaign almost never backs away from something like this. You don't see Republicans kind of jump to distance themselves from stuff like we're seeing now. Why do you think they felt the need to distance themselves from this so quickly to varying degrees?
I think that, I think the varying degrees is important. And I think, someone like Senator Rick Scott, who represents the state of Florida, where there is an extremely large population of people who are born in Puerto Rico, I think it's very obvious why he would do so. I think it is easy for the Trump campaign, right? The Trump campaign mantra is Donald Trump does no wrong. That's not their official mantra. It might as well be. But, Donald Trump does no wrong. This is Donald Trump. So it's easy for them to be like, he said what? Oh, I don't know. People in the room seem to think it was kind of funny, but we wish he hadn't said it. Like, that's a layup, right? It is not as though Donald Trump said this thing and then they have to defend it. And so I think that's the obvious and essential difference.
And by the way, you mentioned Rick Scott, which I think is an important point here. Rick Scott is the senator from Florida. He faces re-election right now. He's favored to win that race, just like Republicans are favored to win in Florida. But this is now the second time in 2 months that Rick Scott has felt compelled to distance himself from a remark that ensnares a significant portion of Florida's population. Last month, he was among the most prominent Republicans to say that, the false claims about Haitians eating and stealing people's pets was not true and was offensive and things like that. So I think that gives you a little bit of a window into where the Trump movement is at right now, that we have this guy who has now done this in consecutive months, felt the need to distance himself from these remarks about people from Caribbean islands. So that's a significant point that I think shouldn't be lost in all this.
I just want to note that Florida is an interesting and unique state where these issues are particularly salient. And it's not just that there is a large population of immigrants from Haiti or transplants from Puerto Rico that live in the state, although it is that. Florida is also a state where the idea that the diversification of the United States ethnically and racially would necessarily mean a more liberal electorate has been challenged the most immediately and successfully by the Republican Party, right? So they wrote a book, came out last year, that looked at the demographics, the projected demographics of the United States in the year 2060. They mirror more closely Florida than anywhere else because Florida has a lot of older people, it has a lot of people who are Hispanic from various points of origin, but it is a place that is also very Republican right now. And so this is not only Rick Scott playing defense, which obviously it is, but it is also necessary for the Republican Party in order to retain that appeal to those particular constituencies, right? It is not just that Rick Scott needs to preserve himself. It is that Florida is a signal point of positivity for the Republican Party in America, which looks different than it used to. And part of that is that they've been able to maintain this relationship with these varying groups of Hispanic voters, which theoretically, not necessarily demonstrably, but theoretically are put at risk by the rhetoric of Donald Trump and his allies.
Yeah, and you mentioned your book. I would encourage people to check out the book. It's called The Aftermath. I believe it's still available at your various booksellers.
I should hope so. If not, let me know.
So I think one thing that's fair to say about our relationship, Philip, is, and tell me if you,
where this is going.
Tell me if you agree with this. No, it's not going to be derogatory towards you, but
very good.
It is that I tend to think stuff matters more than you do. Like, something happens, and Philip will be like,
"Okay,
this is not an insight that has occurred to you before."
Okay. Well, I don't think I would frame it as me being some sort of nihilistic, weird Sartre reading jerk, right?
I did not say that.
Well, it was certainly the implication, but okay, yes. Let's see where this is going. I'll allow it.
Let's just
permission to treat you as hostile. Go ahead.
Let's just say I tend to view things like this as more likely to have an impact. Maybe not a large impact, but like a potential impact that could matter in a close race. And so I was interested to see your piece on Monday, which talked about the Puerto Rican population, people of Puerto Rican heritage, people that were born in Puerto Rico that live in the various swing states. And one of the things that you mentioned was it's not just Florida and Rick Scott, it's also Pennsylvania. There is a large population of people with Puerto Rican heritage in Pennsylvania, which is, of course, the most important swing state, I think, by anyone's measure in the 2024 election. Can you talk about that piece and like how much you do think this could ultimately matter, given, you know, all the things we've been saying here?
Sure. So, yeah, particularly around Philadelphia, there are various counties that have large populations of people who are born in Puerto Rico. Berks County, for example, is a county which is slightly northwest of Philadelphia. It is a county where there are more Puerto Rican residents than the margin by which Trump won the county in 2020, if I'm remembering off the top of my head correctly. There are 4 swing states, in fact, where the Puerto Rican populations are larger than the margins by which they were won in 2020, usually by Joe Biden. And by itself, that's striking. I think it is safe to say, to your earlier disparagements of me as, some sort of weirdo, I do think it is generally the case that we tend to see these political events and overestimate the ripple effects of them, right?
Fair.
I will say, though, that in this election in particular, which has now basically since early August been an election about enthusiasm and turnout, the polls are tied, the polls are staying tied. There's no indication that either candidate has a strong advantage in terms of how they are viewed, but either candidate, I think, can prevail based on who comes out to vote for them. And so we see a lot of focus by both campaigns on getting people to turn out. But in a race where enthusiasm and turnout matters, these are the sorts of things that might tip the scales. The challenge with that is it's hard to predict, right? We see these anecdotes. We hear these stories about the outrage of people born in Puerto Rico who live in Pennsylvania and, now they're activating their families and yada, yada, yada. We hear those things, but those are just anecdotes. And perhaps they're significant. Perhaps they're not. Probably they're not. Maybe this is the difference that you're talking about. Maybe you're more likely to say probably they are. I'm more likely to say probably they're not because I have more experience and a wiser viewpoint here. But we don't know, right? But this is the sort of thing. I appreciate you having a small chuckle there, so listeners will actually be like, "Oh God, the Philip is a gigantic
jerk." Did the microphone pick
jerk.
that up? I don't know if the microphone
It
got
did.
that
Let's
one.
hope. We'll add one in post production here. A hearty guffaw.
No, I'm chuckling.
But this is the sort of thing which maybe can make that sort of difference at the margin, but it's going to be hard to A, say that it will, and B, after the fact, measure that it has. Right? Because we're not going to know necessarily whether, if we see an increase in people who were born in Puerto Rico voting, we're not going to know. Were they going to vote anyway? Were they already feeling as though, I need to get out and cast a ballot? So it's hard to say. And so it's, it is to some extent unfalsifiable when we consider what the effects of these things might be.
Just more broadly speaking, I think we actually both wrote this in our pieces, which is like Tony Hinchcliffe seemed to be surprised by the fact that he didn't get a better response from this. And like he seemed to think that this joke might kill at this rally. There was actually an NBC News report that he had tested out this joke at a comedy club on Saturday night. And it apparently bombed there, but then he reasoned with the crowd that it would do better at the rally on Sunday, which I think is a telling anecdote in and of itself. Sure. But I think this speaks more broadly to like, the Trump campaign does not appear to be making any real effort to tailor their late message to a more moderate. They're not really making pragmatic arguments. A lot of it is very much the enemy within and using the military on the enemy within. Trump's been talking about how migrants have bad genes. I've been really struck that they haven't had Nikki Haley out there at all. Like, this is the one who a lot of these moderate Republicans voted for in the primaries, and they're not even having her out there to make a case for them at this point.
No, they didn't. You and I have had this fight for like 9 months now. Nikki Haley voters were independents who wanted to send a message.
Not
there was
all of
no
them.
law. Of course, not all of them, but there was no big Nikki Haley counter movement in the Republican Party.
Were there independents who voted for Nikki Haley who Trump wants to have vote for him?
Well, I think there probably were a few. Do I think that he is in any way trying to appeal to moderates? No. Do I think there's a lot of moderates? Yes.
Okay,
but
that's
I don't know
my
how they
point.
vote.
That's my point here.
I know that's your point. But
so let's talk about that.
I was trying to transition to actually address it, which is, again, it's a turnout election.
Yeah.
And Donald Trump is just trying to get as many people as he can who already support him to come out and vote. Young dudes who are fascism curious to come out and cast their first votes for president, right? Like that. This is part of what his strategy is at this point in time, because this is a turnout election. And, one of the key messages that he is giving his voters at this point in time is that he needs this election to be too big to rig. But essentially by saying the reason you need to turn out isn't so I win, it's that so I win by a large enough margin that this somehow stymies the Democrats' efforts to steal the election, right?
Yeah. Well, we're going to take a quick break there. Hopefully when we come back, Philip will not be personally attacking me any further.
When have I personally attacked you? What did I say?
When we come back, we're going to be talking about how the Harris campaign is seeking to capitalize on the Trump rally that we're talking about. We'll be right back. So just moments after Tony Hinchcliffe made these comments at the Trump rally on Sunday, we saw a pretty strong reaction from some prominent Puerto Ricans. Bad Bunny, most notably, the Puerto Rican artist who's one of the biggest superstars in the world, endorsed Harris all of a sudden, apparently surprising the Harris campaign. We also saw messages of support for Harris from Ricky Martin, Jennifer Lopez. We've talked about endorsements on this show before, Philip, and at the risk of asking you again how much something matters, I tend to think this is a little bit different than your garden variety endorsement, to have these people, pushing for people to come out and vote and, people being motivated to vote. Right. What are your thoughts on kind of the reaction to this scene at Madison Square Garden from prominent members of the Puerto Rican community?
Yeah, I think it's similar to what happened in the aftermath of Taylor Swift offering her endorsement, right? Like, I don't think there are undecided voters who are, have these lengthy ledgers of the policies and endorsements of each candidate, and they're sort of, doing a calculus between which they prefer, and then they see Taylor Swift down at the bottom of the Kamala Harris, or Bad Bunny for that matter, and are like, okay, well, that tips the scales, right? Like, I don't think that's the case. I think what it is for those particular audiences, for people who look up to those people, or who just generally pay attention to them. But if you are someone who is a big fan of Bad Bunny and you're flipping through Instagram and you're watching clips from his concerts, and all of a sudden you see this thing, this joke, and you see Bad Bunny's response to it, and you're like, oh, that's right, I forgot that I do need to actually go out and vote on Tuesday. Like, that's it, right? Yeah. That's a vote for Kamala Harris that she potentially would not otherwise have had, and that's the benefit. It is not the case that this is necessarily a point of persuasion. It is, not to sound like a broken record, but it is potentially a factor in a race that comes down to who actually turns out to vote.
Right. Philip, what have you seen from the Harris campaign as far as how they're trying to use this against Donald Trump?
Well, I think one of the things, it's a week to Election Day, and so there are probably thousands of ways in which the campaigns broadly, but I think probably the Harris campaign specifically, is trying to get specific messages in front of specific people to ensure that they either turn out to vote or that they are more compelled by her candidacy. This provides that sort of little bit of leverage, right? If Donald Trump were to come out and say that everyone whose name was Steve was a moron, then all of a sudden you would see the Harris campaign pouring $200,000 into text messages to everyone named Steve in the voter database and say, hey, did you see what Donald Trump said about you, right? Like, that's how it works. I mean, so, I think this is a potentially potent thing for the Harris campaign to elevate. There are probably people sitting in the Harris campaign headquarters right now who are watching everything Donald Trump says, and as soon as he says something that is potentially embarrassing or potentially could provide, a few thousand extra votes across the country if you get it in front of the right people, that's their job, and they clip it and they send it out and do it as soon as they possibly can. That's the benefit of having $1 billion, which they don't still have, but you get my point, in order to try and run a national political campaign.
Yeah, and I think they've been doing, web videos like that. I think this is now in an ad. The text messages seems to be a big focus for them. They seem to be investing some real resources in this particular moment in a way that suggests they at least see a potential opening here, whether that's because this is just late in the campaign and it's what they have to work with, or whether they think it's actually a big deal for them is to be determined, as we've talked about.
Yeah, but I mean, what's the downside?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, they have a ton of money in the bank. They obviously have a bunch of TV buys and so on and so forth they need to spend on. They need to spend on GOTV, get out the vote over the course of the next week or so. But they have money to spend. And, this is what you spend your money on. You spend your money on anything which is going to turn someone from a non-voter to a Harris voter or from a Trump voter to a non-voter. Both those things work for the Harris campaign, and then that's what they focus on.
Right. I was reading a piece by our colleagues Sabrina Rodriguez and Hannah Knowles that quoted a Republican strategist saying that Donald Trump may have more or less done what Democrats have been trying to do for years, which is move Latino voters against him. I think it's fair to say that is maybe oversimplifying it a little bit. We're talking more about persuasion instead of actually shifting votes from Trump to Harris. But, why does something like this penetrate in a way, or could it penetrate in a way that all these other policies that we've been talking about for years that could potentially alienate Latino voters, like mass deportation and Trump's derisive and racist comments? Why is this suddenly the big deal in a way that those apparently weren't for these kinds of voters?
I honestly don't know specifically. I think one of them is simply proximity to the election.
Exactly.
I think a second. Oh, okay, great. I got it right. Yes, I didn't realize it was a test.
No, I'll grant you that one.
Excellent. No, I mean, I think that's part of it. I think that the rally itself was intentionally aimed at amplifying the differences between Donald Trump and people who don't like Donald Trump, right? It wasn't just a standard run-of-the-mill rally. It was like the convention redo, right? It was just like it had the same actors as the convention. It has the same rhetoric. It had Hulk Hogan attempting to rip off his shirt, a geriatric old man, a geriatric Terry Bollea roughly pulling at his shirt, right? It was, to some extent, Donald Trump living in the Donald Trump psyche of I am the conquering hero of New York and reliving the moment of the convention, which was absolutely a high watermark for his political career. I think it's safe to say, he seemed like he was going to march to victory and so on and so forth.
The convention, of course, was before Harris got into the race, when it looked like President Biden was the opponent and Trump was looking pretty strong.
Yeah, I mean, he was like up by 5 points in the polls, right? Yeah, I mean, it really was a moment at which he seemed like he was sort of inevitable. So it was a recreation of that, but at the same time was also just pulling together this broad universe of right-wing conversation into one place and one moment and sort of throwing it in the face of the left by being in New York City, intentionally trying to provoke a response. And I think that's part of it too, right? I think one of the things that people underappreciate is how fundamental math is to elections, right? And, the campaigns will often talk about you just need to get 50% of the vote plus one extra vote. But when we're talking about things like this, if you take someone from a 0, they're not going to vote, to a 1 for Harris, where they are going to vote, that makes a difference. And so part of it is that Donald Trump is not someone who comes from the world of politics. He's been very successful in part because of his celebrity, because his approach is very appealing to tens of millions of Americans. But he doesn't do that same sort of calculus. And so that makes this period, I think, there's more opportunity for the Harris campaign and the left in general in moments like this, because they do that math, right? And they do actually figure out, where am I going to cobble together the votes to get to 50% plus 1? This is not the period at which you're going from a -1 of your opponent to a +1 for yourself. This is 0s to 1s. And I think part of the reason that the Garden rally was important is because this is the moment in which you're trying to do that. This is not a moment at which you want to take 1s and turn them to 0s.
Well, I think a math lesson from Philip Bump is an appropriate place to leave it for today's episode. Thank you so much, Philip.
Aaron Blake, it has been my pleasure. You are a scholar and a gentleman, and I want listeners to know you are truly a generous and sweet person, and you deserve accolades.
You're going to make me blush over here. Thank you. That's very nice of you.
That's my goal.
Philip Bump is a national columnist covering politics for the Washington Post and one of my favorite people at the Post, and I'm Aaron Blake, senior political reporter. If you want more analysis of what's happening in the campaign in these final days of the campaign, make sure you're subscribing to my newsletter, also called The Campaign Moment. You can find a link in our show notes and at postreports.com. And if you don't already, make sure you're subscribing to the Campaign Moment podcast feed. You can find us wherever you listen. Philip, can I plug your newsletter?
I was going to say, are there any other newsletters people ought to read?
Yes, there is also another newsletter that I think people should subscribe to, and I read regularly, and that is Philip Bump's How to Read This Chart. It is a weekend edition, so you can spend some time with it. It's very nerdy in a good way, like Philip, and I highly recommend it.
Wow. The nerd who doesn't care about anything. Philip Bump. It's been my pleasure.
The nihilist nerd. I love it.
That's it.
Today's episode was produced by Laura Benshoff and mixed by Sam Bair. It was edited by Lucy Perkins and Mary Jo Murphy. We'll see you later this week.